Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's lecture on representations of LGBTQIA+ communities in education. So I just wanted to briefly go over this week's agenda. Right now, we'll be going over the recorded lecture. So make sure to watch this before Friday's Zoom. And on Friday's Zoom, we'll do a check-in and we'll do some small group activities during our online call. So beginning with our lecture, I wanted to start with an opening quote. This is Marsha P. Johnson, who is very commonly known as one of the architects of the queer liberation movement and the Stonewall resistance in New York City in the late 1960s. One of the big icons and founders of our civil rights movement today. This is a quote from her: "No pride for some of us without liberation for all of us." And often she's been a forgotten figure in our queer history, but a lot of her legacy has been resurrected in the last couple of years. So I hope you keep this quote in mind as I summarize some of the points from this week's readings. So first off, in talking about assimilationist and transgressive representations in media, let's start with assimilationist representations. As you know, when you think about media representations in film, in television, social media, other forms of media, when it comes to LGBTQIA+ individuals, these representations have often been white, affluent, middle class, and gender conforming. Oftentimes, these representations reflect lived experiences that are consciously or unconsciously edited so that they appeal to heterosexual audiences and cisgender people. Oftentimes, they're edited by those folks who create these representations in the first place. So when you think about media, when you think about film, think of the people who control the production of the films. So the people who fund it, the CEOs of film companies and television companies and corporations, the people who direct, the people who make decisions on what representations actually get allowed to be given to the mass public. Oftentimes when we see these media representations over and over and over again, there is an overall message that heterosexual and gender conforming identities require that we assimilate in a manner that is consistent with the norms of our culture. So even people within the queer community, so gay men for instance, after watching these types of assimilationist media representations, we often receive the message that it's important for us to, in the best way, assimilate to dominant norms of masculinity and so forth. When we try to be as close to the heterosexual and gender conforming identities and those norms, what we're doing also is we're denying the uniqueness and the wide spectrum of difference that's part of our community. Assimilationist queer people or representations, they're also framed by this overarching goal that it's more important to achieve acceptance from the mainstream society that is heterosexual and cisgender people, rather than demanding for our own liberation, showing the uniqueness of our community, showing the diversity of our community as queer people. To bring it, to give you, to make it more clear for you, here are some assimilationist representations in media in the last 20 years. If you look at the left-hand side, you'll see Pete Buttigieg and his partner. Mayor Pete was a recent presidential candidate. And if you look at that picture, the two of them as queer individuals, as gay men, they are gay. However, they also reflect, just even in their clothing, dominant masculine norms of how men should look like in our society. If you look at Anderson Cooper, if you look at Ellen DeGeneres and Portia de Rossi, in addition to reflecting gender norms and being safe representations of queer people, they're also very affluent. If you look at the bottom right, You have different stereotypes of gay men. You have this scene from Will and Grace. If you look at Will, he's more on the Will who is on the right-hand side of this picture. He is more of a masculine representation of gay men, and so was more popular in the show. So these are just a couple of representations of gay people in the media. And if you know, in addition, if you look at everybody in this picture, most, if not all of the individuals in these pictures are white. Oftentimes, if you think about LGBTQIA plus content in our education textbooks, these also tend to limit our community's representations to what is most appealing and what is most considered normal to our mainstream society. Oftentimes in education textbooks, when there are representations of queer individuals, they're often in two-person dyads, so married individuals, people in monogamous relationships. Oftentimes they're included in examples related to childbearing, so they might be parents. Oftentimes it reflects monogamous relationships, or what is more commonly called closed sexual kinships. And oftentimes they're engaged in material acquisition, so consuming something, or being affluent or upper middle class, being full participants in the capitalist system. So oftentimes, as I said before, this privileges masculine appearing gay cisgender men and feminine appearing lesbians. And what this does again is it excludes all the difference that is in our community. So that includes trans folks, queer individuals, and also queer individuals who have intersectional lived experiences related to class, related to race, gender identity and expression, disability, and other queer non-monogamous relationships and structures. So where do we go from here? Now that the movement has been so focused on assimilationist representations, when the representations of queer folks in our textbooks and education have been so assimilationist, we advocate now for a move to include more transgressive representations in our classrooms, in our schools, so that students will learn about the full diversity of our community. And this is one quote from the readings that resonated a lot with me. And that is, the inability or refusal of diverse people to conform to dominant norms and identities is often seen as transgressive, in the sense that their nonconformity challenges and disrupts structures of privilege and discrimination. So a transgressive perspective of education advocates for the following points. So it recognizes intersectionality, so race, class, gender, other lived experiences within the queer community. It recognizes power and privilege by naming them explicitly. So when you think about the contrast of class experiences, for instance, in the queer community, what creates those types of differences? What economic system creates those differences? What institutions reinforce those differences and those forms of oppression that exist within our community? Oftentimes in the classroom, when we're confronted with differences among queer people, for instance, non-monogamous relationships, when those questions are raised in classroom discussions, instead of teachers shying away from those conversations, we can transform those questions into complex moments. So if you remember in the reading when Dr. Jennings was talking about a student who was asking him in the middle of class, they posed the question, are you and your partner monogamous? The author, so Dr. Jennings, knowing that he was non-monogamous, was introduced into the situation with a lot of complexity. So it was a tense moment. Does he reveal to his students the queerness and the non-monogamous nature of his relationship structure? Or does he lie in order to, conform to a lot of the social norms that his students were used to, a lot of the heterosexist social norms that his students were used to? And so instead of shying away from this conversation, Dr. Jennings advocates that we transform these situations into complex moments, to treat them as sites in our classrooms, as spaces in our classrooms to engage in larger, broader discussions about monogamy and queer relationships in this particular example. Transgressive perspectives of education also include LGBTQIA plus representations that challenges the privileging of white middle-class dyadic lifestyles. So in our class textbooks, when we talk about queer people, in media representations, when we talk about queer people, in classroom discussions, we encourage this integration and inclusion of representations of queer people that are not white, that are not middle class, that are not dyadic. And in the end, when we talk about difference, when we talk about the full spectrum of queer diversity, we're privileging liberation, not conformity. I wanted to show you some examples of transgressive representations in the last couple of decades. If you look at the top left-hand corner, you have Moonlight, which was a film that won the Best Picture Oscar a couple of years ago that highlighted the journey, the life journey of a Black gay man growing up and recognizing his queer identity. What the film did a great job at was really talking about the complexity of coming out as it intersects with the racism that he faced as a Black man, the class poverty that he faced, and other lived experiences that we don't typically hear about when we see queer individuals in film. When you look at this picture right next to Moonlight to the right, this is RuPaul. This was actually a talk show from the 1990s on VH1. The first talk show to highlight a transgressive representation of a queer person in media. And so RuPaul, one of the icons of the drag queen movement and the community, was one of the early queer transgressive representations in our pop culture in the 80s and 90s. When you look at the bottom row, if you see Addie Vincent, who's in the blue jacket, this is an alumni of Chapman University. Addie came out as trans and non-binary while at Chapman in the early 20-teens, and is now an activist, a popular motivational speaker nationally who talks about trans and non-binary issues, but also other issues relating to our movement. Also represents or presents as someone who's non-conforming, challenging, the norms that we have associated with masculinity and femininity. So taking in all of that knowledge right now, there are two media clips that follow this recorded lecture. And I want you to watch these two clips. They're in the following two slides. And keep in mind the following points. So you're going to see assimilationist. The following clips show assimilationist and or transgressive representations of LGBTQIA+ communities. And I want you in a paragraph to explain why. You're not going to submit this to me as the instructor, but I want you to bring your response to our online class this Friday so that you can share it with your small group. So you will find the next two clips, the next two slides. They're about 15 minutes in all, so, but they're a good example of these concepts that we covered today. So enjoy watching.